Good morning. My name's Tom Fries. I'll be with you for the next hour here. We're going to continue our reading and discussion of the book, The Ark and the Dove by J. Moss Ives, a writing of the colonial establishment of the colony of Maryland, more correctly pronounced. A colony settled by a mixture of Protestants and Catholics. I think it's more appropriate to call it a Catholic colony, but the main thrust, at least according to this author, was that in the Maryland colony, maybe the first example in the colonial period of complete religious liberty. But this isn't a study of the Maryland colony per se. This is a study of how the Vatican planted its seed that has eventually grown from a sapling to a huge tree that now the birds of this nation roost. The birds, the demons of this nation roost. That's in our own government. How the Vatican has taken control of our government. How this country is systematically being reduced from a land of religious freedom to a papal hegemony. And not only to make America Catholic, but to make the world Catholic in a global papal hegemony. Now, hopefully we'll learn in this book some things that will serve us to understand what is happening in our country and the world today. The purpose of reading history is to be able to more accurately understand current events. History repeats itself. Now, when we ended yesterday, we were talking about the first settlement, the first Maryland settlement of St. Mary's on the St. Mary's River. And it says there was an Indian village on the site, but there was no taking of land by force. Payment was made neither in firearms nor firewater, which too often had been the medium of payment between white settlers and Indians, but in implements of husbandry. These the Indians, quote, accepted kindly and freely gave consent, unquote. This was half a century before William Penn used the same method of negotiations in purchasing the soil of his first Quaker settlement in Pennsylvania. Father White told in his narrative how the names of Catholic saints were used to christen all the places of interest, but much of the christening was in vain, for few of the names survived the Protestant Revolution of later years. Even the name of St. Mary's had a narrow escape. In the year 1644, the Puritan government, then in temporary power, voted to change the name of St. Mary's County to Potomac, quote, upon the theory that too much honor should not be given to the Blessed Virgin, unquote. Now you can see how this might inflame some Catholics, but Bible readers know that though Mary was blessed and that she brought forth our Savior, Mary is not deity. Mary is a humble servant of the Lord, just as so many others throughout history. Blessed though she is, she's not to be venerated as a god, and she is no co-mediatrix, and she's no co-redemptrix, and she does not speak, she does not appear, but these are all lies and demonic apparitions. And the Roman Catholic Church is built around that cult. And it is spoken of old in the Scriptures, the Queen of Heaven. And this is one of the most identifiable characteristics of apostasy, a female deity. And so we'll continue. Obviously, the Protestants regarded it best to change the name from St. Mary's County to Potomac upon the theory that too much honor should not be given to the Blessed Virgin, unquote. And it says, when the colony was restored to Lord Baltimore, the name was changed back again to St. Mary's. American history has bestowed the title of Pilgrims upon the little band of English separatists who landed unexpectedly on the coast of New England on a bleak November day in 1620. It has therefore been difficult to give this name to any other group of colonists. Both the first settlers of Massachusetts and Maryland had come to America seeking religious liberty and freedom from persecution. The English Catholics, however, had suffered more from persecution than had the Puritans, and this may have been one of the reasons why those who came on the Ark and the Dove had a broader conception of the idea of religious liberty than those who came on the Mayflower, according to this author. And he says, as a matter of fact, neither the voyages of the Mayflower nor those of the Ark and the Dove came within the strict dictionary definition of the word pilgrim. But in a broader sense, both groups were pilgrims for religious motives. Were dominant in both voyages. Some recent writers vigorously contend that the coming to America of the Mayflower pilgrims was purely a commercial enterprise, that these English separatists had found in Holland the freedom from persecution and the religious sanctuary they sought. But as their lot had become a hard one, bowed down as they were by poverty, it was solely to better their material condition that they decided to migrate to America. While this is true to an extent, yet it is not all. They were under foreign rule, strangers in a strange land. Their children were being led away from the faith of their parents, intermarrying with their Holland neighbors, and they saw the danger, if they stayed in Holland, of finally losing their nationality, their language, and their faith. So it was they who sought asylum in America, where they would be free to worship God in their own fashion, remain English subjects, and preserve their nationality and their language. With the strong religious background of the voyage of the Ark and the Dove, the effect of the first Lord Baltimore's conversion to the Catholic faith on his plan of colonization and a solemn dedication of the project by Father White in his Declaratio Coloniae to the cause of the Christian religion, it seems idle to contend that the religious motives was not the dominant factor in the first migration to Maryland. Those who came on the Ark and the Dove came on a pilgrimage to a land of sanctuary, where the hand of persecution was stayed. They chose to call themselves, quote, the Pilgrims of St. Mary's, unquote, and by this name are entitled to be known, according to this author. Now, Chapter 2 of the book, of this second section, called the seeding, or the preparation, is the Chapter 2 of this section is entitled Old St. Mary's. And he begins by saying it was a pretty bit of country that the Pilgrims of St. Mary's had chosen for their home in America, and no one ever described it as so well as Father White. To him it was indeed the land of promise, a land of flowing with milk and honey. He sang the praises of Maryland with a heart full of joy and gladness. Not only did he see fields as white for the harvest of the gospel, but he had an added interest which came from his knowledge and love of natural history. He described the equable climate, the mildness of the winter, the glory of springtime, the luxuriance of the summer, and the beauty of the autumn, and the long Indian summer that lingered between autumn and winter. He told of fallow fields and gentle sloping hills, of broad streams and rich meadowlands, of safe harbors, of inlets and estuaries that afforded means of transportation and plenteous yield of fish, of strange and beautiful trees in the woods and forests, of medicinal herbs, and of the crops of Indian maize, that's corn. And he said, he told also of birds of brilliant plumage, such as the settlers had never seen before, scarlet tanager, and the American oriole dressed in rich gold and black, the colors of the House of Baltimore, and henceforth to be dear to Maryland's eyes. There was little that escaped his observation, and his relation of Maryland, written in English when the voyage was ended, he concluded, quote, "It'll therefore end with the soil, which is excellent, so that we cannot set down a foot but tread on strawberries, raspberries, fallen mulberry vines, acorns, walnuts, sassafras, etc., and those in the wildest woods. The ground is of a reddish color. All is high woods except where the Indians have cleared for corn. It abounds with delicate springs, which are our best drink. Birds diversely feathered there are infinite, as eagles, swans, herons, geese, bitterns, ducks, partridge, red, blue, party-colored, and the like, by which will appear the place abounds, not alone with profit, but also with pleasure." Lost Deo. He's, unquote, and he continues, he says, "As soon as the Pilgrims had established their settlement at St. Mary's, it was time for the early spring planting. The seed corn, which they had brought from Barbados, was placed in the soil where before the Indians had harvested their crops. The squaws showed their white sisters how to make bread from Indian maize. It says the braves instructed the white men how to hunt the game that was abundant in the forest and accompanied them in the chase. Gardens were planted with seeds brought from England, and before the summer was over, the wooded bluff of St. Mary's was transformed from an Indian village to a thriving English settlement. In 6 months, Maryland had advanced more than Virginia had done in as many years. As St. Mary's was the capital of the colony, it was afterwards incorporated as a city and is generally referred to as St. Mary's City, yet it never lost its character as a little English village. The houses at no time exceeded 60 and were located at some distance from each other in the manner of English townhouses. James Walter Thomas of the Maryland Historical Society devoted much patient research to the early settlement days. In his Chronicles of the Colonial Maryland, he gives a pleasant picture of the little capital. Quote, "A gentle slope from the eastern hills, then a spacious plateau of singular beauty, elevated about 40 feet above the water and terminating in the bold bluff between two broad expanses of river," unquote, formed the site of St. Mary's City. This is a quote, it says, "A river possessing more enchanting scenery than the St. Mary's may not easily be found, and at no place along its banks is this displayed to greater advantage than at the site of old St. Mary's. Looking from thence, either towards the north, where its clear and glittering waters are first seen winding down the blue vista of the distant hills, with its sloping banks and intercepted by its long, narrow capes and jutting cliffs, or toward the south, where its waters, growing bolder and deeper with its high grassy banks, upland slopes, abrupt declivities, white winding beaches, pebble shore, and is seen from the direction of its mouth, its interlocking promontories, giving it the appearance of a series of lakes rather than a stream of regular width. It presents a picture of rare and exquisite beauty," unquote. At first, the Pilgrims found shelter in the homes of the Indians, but it was not long before houses were built. The first houses were log cabins with hand-hewn frames and clapboard siding thatched with crude green shingles. These cabins had brick chimneys, and later houses of brick were built. Although some brick was imported from England, most of what was used came from the clay soil of the surrounding country, which was found to be excellent material for the purpose. Under Lord Baltimore's instruction, the colonists were directed, after having selected a suitable place for their permanent settlement, quote, to seat a town, unquote, in which they were to cause streets to be marked out, and to require the buildings to be erected in line with such streets in near adjoining one to another. All the houses to be constructed in, quote, as decent and uniform a manner as circumstances permitted, the land in the rear of the houses to be used for gardens. The first choice of lots was to be a fit place and a competent quantity of ground for a fort, and near to this was to be a house with a church and a chapel adjacent for the seat of his lordship or his governor. A survey and plot of the town was to be made and sent to Lord Baltimore. Thomas states that it is to be regretted that no chart of the city of the Calverts was made before it had disappeared, except in name and memory, from the banks of the St. Mary's. From original surveys and grants, ancient transfers and resurveys, together with many natural boundaries and landmarks still visible, a map was platted, which was printed in the appendix of the Chronicles of Maryland. By this data, obtained after exhaustive research, the outlines of the city and the location of its public as well as its more prominent private buildings have been preserved. The first permanent building of any size to be erected was St. Mary's Fort. This was built in 1634 on a small bluff at the mouth of the Keys Creek, between the governor's lot and the chapel land. According to Thomas, at the time the fort was built, the settlers were in the midst of building their houses, but becoming alarmed by the warlike attitude of the Indians, they ceased building and at once set to work to erect a fort for their better security. This they completed in about 6 weeks. Governor Calvert described it as a palazzo of 120 yards square with four flanks, unquote. Thanks to the labors of the Jesuit missionaries, there were no Indian attacks. The fort, being the only building of considerable size, was used for more peaceful purposes than intended. For several years it was used as a state house and for the transaction of public business. The first 3 colonial assemblies were held there. Adjoining the fort on the south and the east was St. Mary's Chapel Yard, while on the north and west was the land of Governor Leonard Calvert, known as Governor's Field. On this land the governor's residence was built, but of its architecture little is known. In the inventory of his estate, it is described as a large frame building. Subsequently, the lower and northern portion of this land came into possession of Hugh Lee, one of the early colonists who built a brick house upon it, which in 1662 was purchased by the province for a quote-unquote government house, and was used as such until the State House was erected in 1876. This was the first real estate ever owned by the colony of Maryland, and that part of the lot known as St. Mary's Bluff became the site of the public buildings and later the State House. Here was erected a house later described as the Old Courthouse, which contained the Secretary's office, council chamber, and St. Mary's room. On St. Mary's Bluff stood the historic mulberry tree. Under its spreading branches, the pilgrims of St. Mary's first assembled in accordance with the instructions of Lord Baltimore to, quote, assemble all the people together in a fit and decent manner, unquote, to hear the royal charter read, and to listen to a declaration of, quote, his lordship's intentions, which he means to pursue in this his plantations, unquote, the first of which was for, quote, the honor of God by endeavoring the conversion of the savages to Christianity, unquote. According to traditionary history, It was under the shade of this tree that the Catholic pilgrims assembled for their first Mass at St. Mary's, and it was here that a treaty was made between Governor Calvert and the Yokomico Indians. The tree was used for many years as the official signpost, for on it were nailed the proclamations of the governor and other public notices. Thomas, writing in 1913, said that, quote, within comparatively recent years, even curious relic hunters were able to pick from its decaying trunk the rude nails which there held the forgotten state papers of 2 centuries and more ago, unquote. He further says, quote, this aged tree had watched over the city in its infancy, in its development and prosperity, and in its pride and glory as the metropolis of Maryland. It had seen it stripped of its prestige and honors and lose its importance and its rank. It had witnessed its battle with adversity and its downfall and decline, and it has mourned the departure of nearly every symbol of its existence and memorial of its glory, which under the winning game of time had one by one faded and passed away, unquote. The Relatio Itineris, Father White, after describing the wigwams of the Indians, which were used as temporary abodes by the white settlers until dwellings could be erected, told how one of the quote-unquote cabins of the chieftains had, quote, fallen to me and my associates, in which we are accommodated well enough for the time until larger dwellings are provided. You would recall this the first chapel of Maryland, Primum Marylandae Seculum, though it is fitted up more decently than when the Indians lived in it, unquote. To this wigwam of an Indian chieftain in the primitive village of St. Mary's in 1634, the Roman Catholic Church in the United States can trace its juridical beginning. It is not known just when the first chapel was built, but it was probably during the first 2 or 3 years of settlement. Lord Baltimore indicated in his instructions that a house and a church and a chapel for the seat of his lordship and his governor should be built. It is to be assumed that such a church or chapel would be a place of worship for those of the Catholic faith. There was nothing in the royal charter to prohibit the erection of Catholic chapels or churches, and King Charles, whose wife was allowed to have a Catholic chapel on the royal premises, was no doubt fully aware, as were the members of the Privy Council, that Lord Baltimore would expect to erect a Catholic place of worship for all those of his faith who were able to make their homes in Maryland. A description of the location and general character of the chapel is thus described by Thomas. Quote, on the south and east side of the fort was the chapel land. It extended from Keys Creek across the plateau to the fresh waters of St. John's. The chapel itself stood near the intersection of Middle and Mattapony streets, fronting northeast on the former street. It was a brick building, and judging from its foundation lines, it was about 18 by 30 feet. We'll continue with a quote when we get back from the break. You're listening to Inquisition Update on LibertyRadioLive.com, The Ark and the Dove by J. Moss Ives. We'll be right back.
Hear it first on FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Have you seen the Left Behind movies? Have you read the Left Behind fictional book series? Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character. as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. Because they see the world stage shaping to fulfill what they have been led to believe is sound biblical interpretation, a left-behind rapture scenario, this false view of prophecy is reinforced in the mind, not only of its adherents, but also includes those who have been merely exposed to the specific media. Is it possible that false prophecy can be fulfilled? The rapture theories have always been in dispute. Pre-trib, mid-trib, and post-trib disputes have risen up in exclusively evangelical circles of recent history, so that when true believers don't suddenly disappear, this element will easily go by the wayside when all see a new Jewish temple begin to be built. Will this be part of the great delusion that will come upon the whole earth? It seems that this great prophetic delusion has already overcome practically the entire American evangelical and Christian world. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. To learn more, visit crosstheborder.org. That's CROSS, crosstheborder.org.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host, Melody Cedarstrom, right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit DiscountGoldandSilverTrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free, 1-800-375-4188.
The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.
Welcome back to Inquisition Update. Now, this book, The Ark and the Dove, came heavily recommended by John Daniel to help us understand how we got to where we are today in this New World Order, the Vatican's control of our government. Now, we're going over some rather mundane information at this point, but we'll continue to make sure we don't lose any significance that might be contained in this information. He's describing the location and general character of the chapel. He's described by Thomas here. He says, on the south and east side of the fort was the chapel land. It extended from Keys Creek across the plateau to the fresh waters of the St. John's Creek. It says the chapel itself stood near the intersection of Middle and Mattapony Streets, fronting northeast and on the former street. It was a brick building, and judging from its foundation line, still visible in recent period, it was about 18 by 30 feet. Over the altar was a carved representation of clouds and the flames of Pentecost. The exact date of its erection has not been ascertained, but it was prior to 1638, and it was undoubtedly, barring the little wigwam fitted up by Father White and called by him the first chapel of Maryland, the first church built by the Maryland colonists, unquote. A few years ago, Father John Lafarge's Society of Jesus, he was a Jesuit priest, who spent several years in educational work in the mission parishes of southern Maryland, including St. Mary's, and Professor Daniels, principal of the Cardinal Gibbons Institute at Ridge, were able to definitely locate the foundations of the first chapel at St. Mary's and found it to be at the location given by Thomas. They discovered one of the corners of the foundation, and by means of soundings were able to trace all the foundation walls. The exact dimensions of the chapel building were found to be 32.5 by 28.5 feet, somewhat larger than the dimensions given by Thomas. It has been suggested that in proof of the harmony and concord existing between the Catholics and Protestants in early Maryland, this chapel was built by their joint contributions and was used in common between them as a union chapel. No proof of this kind is needed, however, to show that there was religious concord in the early days of the colony. There's reason to believe that from the beginning this chapel was used exclusively as a Roman Catholic place of worship. The Protestants who came over on the Ark and the Dove were for the most part Anglicans and called themselves English Catholics. That's what I'd call them too, by the way. He says they were no doubt admitted to and did worship in the Catholic chapel, but there's no proof that Protestant services were held there or that it was in that sense a union chapel. The chapel lot was first surveyed by Father John Brooke, who became superior of the American Jesuit mission. The deed to the land was taken in the name of Thomas Copley, a Jesuit mission priest, who was known officially as Father Philip Fisher. It contained 25 acres and was bounded, quote, on the east by St. Peter's, south by Giles Brent's land, west by Keys Branch, and north by a line drawn from Keys Branch at the Vale to the brook where St. Peter's ends, being about 25 perches above the mill, unquote. The fact that this was a Roman Catholic chapel and under the charge of Jesuit missionaries is indicated by two letters written by Father Copley, that is, Fisher. In 1638, he asked Lord Baltimore, quote, that the church and our houses may be sanctuary, unquote. In 1643, he wrote to his superior inquiring whether, quote, our public chapels not consecrated as yet, but only dedicated, have the privileges of those indulgences granted to other churches of the society, unquote. The answer to this query was in the affirmative, that the ceremony of consecration was not necessary for the purpose of giving to a church or chapel the character and privileges of a Jesuit church. Neither the request for sanctuary nor the question about consecration would have been relevant if the building had been a union chapel or general meeting house. There are a few relics of old St. Mary's and the first Catholic chapel in the museum at Georgetown University. These include, among others, an old pewter chalice and paten, which were used by Father White in the Mass of St. Clement's Island and later in the chapel, a cross made of wood of the old mulberry tree, the bell which is said to have been used in the chapel, and a picture of Ignatius Loyola which was brought over by Father White in the Ark. When, under order of the Governor's Council in 1704, the Catholic chapel was closed to public worship, the bricks and furniture were taken to St. Inigo's mission, and afterwards the manor house there was built of the bricks. The first Protestant church or chapel was erected in 1642. It was probably built of wood, and its architecture, it is only known that it had an arched ceiling, after the design of which the State House ceiling was subsequently modeled. With the exception of the monument erected to commemorate the life and services of Governor Leonard Calvert and a small memorial tablet on the bluff, for 300 years there was little to mark the site of the first settlement. The tercentennial year brought, among the other centennials, the reproduction of the first State House, which accords the specifications laid down by the General Assembly of 1674. Just 200 years after the landing of the Pilgrims of St. Mary's, Bancroft wrote that, quote, "Religious liberty obtained a home, its only home in the wide world, at the humble village which bore the name of St. Mary." St. Mary's, unquote. The site of the old city of St. Mary's should long ago have been made one of the shrines of American history, for here surely is hallowed ground. So, there's what the Catholics think of this first settlement in the colonies of St. Mary's. It should have long ago been one of the shrines of American history. You get the idea that this Maryland colony is being fashioned after the teachings of Bellarmine, the Jesuit priest, who we discovered in F. Tupper Saucy's book, Rulers of Evil, was teaching that all rights were born in the breasts of the people, and that government should serve the people, and that people should have liberty and freedom, all the tenets of which are specifically denounced in Roman Catholic canon law and in papal encyclicals and papal bulls. I remember remarking when reading that book, Rulers of Evil by F. Tupper Saucy, how remarkable the teachings of Bellarmine were, in contrast, diametrically opposing the official teaching of the Roman Catholic Church. And it has been asserted by some of the people that I've talked to about this book that the United States is nothing but a Jesuit enclave for a much greater purpose than has ever been told to its people. And that's going to be the subject of a future discussion that I hope to hold with John Daniels, and I hope in not too distant future. We're going to talk about the very purpose behind this so-called Jesuit enclave, where for the first time in the history of the Roman Catholic Church, Catholics are amenable to religious liberty and allowed Protestants and other non-Catholics to grow up side by side in peace. And the suggestion is clear, that to accomplish their ultimate goal and mission for this country, that peace was a necessity. That peace was a necessity at a future time when it could be discarded. And I believe we're seeing the beginnings of those days here in this country. And now, with what time remains, I'm going to continue now reading in chapter 3 of this section, of the second section of this book. It's entitled Christian and Heathen Neighbors. He says, the Pilgrims of St. Mary's were a kindly and friendly folk who desired to be on good terms with their neighbors. It so turned out, through no fault of theirs, that the only neighbors whose friendship they could cultivate were that of the Indians. Their Christian neighbors did not care to have cordial relations with them. Even in their new home, the Catholic colonists found themselves again between two fires, with the Puritans on the north, with their hatred both of prelacy and papacy, and Cavaliers on the south with their antagonism toward dissenters and papists. In the summer following the settlement of St. Mary's, Governor Leonard Calvert tried to open friendly trade relations with the Puritan colony in Massachusetts. Later, in August of 1634, the Little Dove was sent to Boston with a cargo of corn, which it expected would be exchanged for a cargo of fish. Massachusetts was already famous for its cod. The Dove carried a friendly letter from Governor Calvert and also one from Governor Harvey of Virginia. The Virginia colonists had already opened trade relations with Massachusetts, and the Maryland colonists had no reason to anticipate any difficulty in establishing similar relations which would be mutually profitable. So when the Dove set sail for Boston with her cargo of corn and her friendly letters, there was no expectation for the rude reception she would receive. As soon as it became known after the arrival of the Dove at Boston Harbor that the crew was mostly Catholic, some of them deigned to call the Puritans their holy brethren, and that in the Maryland colony from whence the Dove sailed, they did set up mass openly, there was at once evident a feeling of unfriendliness and suspicion, which soon took shape in open hostility. Hildreth says, quote, "Just as the ship was about to sail, the supercargo happening on shore was arrested in order to compel the master to give up the culprits. The proof failed, and the vessel was suffered to depart, but not without special charge to the master to, quote, bring no more such disordered persons," unquote. The corn sent to Massachusetts was from the first planting of the old Indian fields, the Indians having helped both in the planting and the harvest. The Puritans were quite willing to trade with the heathen, but refused to exchange fish for corn with their Christian neighbors who did not happen to be of their own denomination. Undeterred by this incident, we find Governor Calvert several years later in 1643 sending a commission to Captain Gibbons of Massachusetts offering, quote, free liberty of religion, unquote, to such of the people of New England as were willing to remove to Maryland. The invitation was not accepted. Quote, there were those in New England at the time, says Engelston, who longed for a more genial climate, but to settle under the authority of a papist was to them like pitching a tent on the confines of perdition, unquote. An Anglican historian, Reverend Francis Hawkes, Doctor of Divinity, formerly rector of St. Thomas Church in New York, in his Rise and Progress of the Episcopal Church in Maryland, makes caustic comment on the Puritan rejection of Governor Calvert's invitation. Quote, this letter to Gibbons reached Boston about the time of a transaction which it were to be wished could not be written upon the records of New England's history. The inhabitants of Massachusetts had but just been thrown into pious consternation by the stupid and unintelligent ravings of Gorton and his followers, which merited nothing but contempt, and were now settling down to repose, produced by a sentence upon the poor sufferers which proposed to curse heresy with fetters. At such a time, to offer liberty of religion to men who were congratulating themselves upon the successful application of their iron preservative of orthodoxy, doubtless provoked a sneer at the stupidity which could present toleration merely as a temptation to removal. Human ingenuity could not have devised a better timed or keener rebuke than is contained in this offer of religious freedom from the persecuted papist and his Protestant fellow sufferer of human wit. Human wit could not have made the memory of that rebuke more lasting than it is made by the scornful rejection of the offer," unquote. While Catholic Maryland was opening the door to Puritans as well as to all other Christian sects, Puritan Massachusetts closed the doors to all who were not of her own particular faith. If a Catholic priest came into the colony, he was to be banished. If he returned, he was to be hanged. Of all those who made trouble for Lord Baltimore and the early colonists of Maryland, Captain William Claiborne of the colony of Virginia showed the greatest amount of pertinacity and kept up his opposition longer than anyone else. Like many another long-continued controversy started and kept up by a single individual, it all had to do with the question of the ownership of land. Claiborne was not particularly interested in religion, but he made capital of religious prejudices and fanned the flames of bigotry in order to serve his own purpose. At different times, he espoused the cause of Cavalier, Roundhead, Anglican, and Puritan. It mattered little to him who his allies were or what cause he served. One writer of the day said it was not religion, quote, he stood upon, it was that sweet, that rich, that large country, unquote, that he coveted. On the east shore of the Chesapeake was a large island known as Kent Island. Claiborne claimed to own it. He arrived in Virginia in 1621 and immediately applied for and received the office of surveyor of the colony. He was industrious and acquired a considerable estate. He engaged in a prosperous trade with the Indians and established his trading headquarters on Kent Island. He never had a grant of land. All he had was the right of a squatter. He claimed that the island was not included in the Maryland patent, and as some of the leading colonists of Virginia had opposed the Maryland grant, he was able to enlist their sympathy in his attempt to oust Lord Baltimore from possession. He became a member of the Virginia Council and later was appointed Secretary of State to Virginia, so he was able to command considerable influence. Kent Island was clearly within the Maryland grant, and Claiborne was never able to prove his title, but for 20 years he became the proverbial thorn in the flesh of the Calverts, and he showed all the persistence of the confirmed litigant. He was the most active enemy of the Maryland colony and twice nearly brought it to destruction. Governor Calvert made every effort to have friendly relations with Claiborne, offered to give him such trading rights as he might desire, and grant him possession of as much land as he might reasonably, as might be reasonably necessary for him, but all to no avail. Claiborne wanted absolute ownership or nothing. Lord Baltimore had learned of Claiborne's claim to Kent Island before the sailing of the Ark of the Dove, and instructed his commissioners to treat him courteously and to invite him to a friendly conference. Claiborne spurned all offers of an amicable settlement. He seemed to prefer hostility. Governor Calvert attempted to bring about trade relations with Virginia, and although he had the cooperation of Governor Harvey, his attempts were thwarted. Governor Harvey had been instructed to assist the Maryland colonists in every way possible. In the fall of 1634, he wrote to the Privy Council that he counted it as part of his happy days any service that he did to Lord Baltimore, but he found that he had almost all against him when he proposed to do anything for Maryland. Notwithstanding, quote, the obligations of Christianity and His Majesty's commands, unquote, to assist the new colonists, quote, many are so averse, unquote, that they declared that, quote, they should rather knock their cattle on the head than sell them to Maryland, unquote. Governor Harvey finally sent cattle of his own to Maryland and said that he would do his best to procure anything else he might stand in need of. As Harvey made it manifest that he was friendly to Lord Baltimore and anxious to serve his colony, Claiborne made plans to weaken the governor's power, claiming he was a friend of papists. This was enough to stir up all the smoldering fires of bigotry in the colony, and Harvey soon found that his power and influence was gone. He was sent back to England to answer charges Claiborne had made against him. Even before his departure, a new governor was chosen in his place. Captain Thomas Young, in command of a trading vessel, wrote to a friend in England that in Virginia, quote, it was counted as a crime almost as heinous as treason to favor, nay, almost to speak well of Maryland. And he observed a palpable kind of strangeness and distance between those of the best sort in the country who have formerly been very familiar and loving one to another, only because one hath been suspected, but to have been a well-wisher to the plantation in Maryland. Unquote. It is related that one Samuel Matthews, on reading a letter from England advising friendly relations with the colonists of Maryland, threw his hat on the ground and shouted, quote, "A pox upon Maryland," unquote. In the spring of 1634, Claiborne sent an army sloop, very appropriately named the Cockatrice, to St. Mary's with orders to capture any Maryland vessels that might be found. Hearing of this, Governor Calvert fitted out 2 pinnaces under the command of Captain Thomas Cornwallis to repel the invaders. Claiborne's men first opened fire, killing 1 man and wounding several. Captain Cornwallis returned the fire, with such effort that Captain Warren, who was in command, and 2 others were killed, and the Cockatrice surrendered. Thus added what was said to be the first naval engagement to be fought in American waters. There was another engagement the following month in the harbor of Great Wicomico, in which Claiborne's men evidently had the best of it, for he gained temporary possession of the island. In neither of these engagements was Claiborne present. In fact, whenever there was any fighting to be done, he was always conveniently absent. That wraps it up. Stay tuned for Nicholas Arthur's Cross the Border.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org. When it comes to prophecy today, much of the evangelical Christian world has their eyes on Israel, waiting and watching to see when the third temple will begin to be built. The plans are drawn, the Jewish people are eager. Most evangelical Christians today believe that the rapture will happen before the third temple is built. Hi, I'm Michael Eugene. I was taught that Daniel's 70th week was in the future. Is that really what the Bible teaches? Have we searched the Scriptures and found this to be true? Why is it so important for a re-established Israel to build a third temple in Jerusalem? Is it necessary to build a temple on the same location already occupied by the Dome of the Rock? Is it necessary for sacrifices to take place in the temple on Temple Mount? Is there really a rapture followed by 7 years of tribulation? What is the New Testament temple? Can we identify history and prophecy? Who is the first beast in Revelation chapter 13? Who are the 7 kings in Revelation 17? I have asked all these questions, and I have found Nicholas Arthur's new book, When the Third Temple is Built, answers all these questions and more using Scripture to interpret Scripture. The Bible says that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation. Nicholas shows us in his new book, When the Third Temple is Built, how the Bible interprets prophecy and not man's private interpretation. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org.